Now, since Democrats have done everything in their power to make sure that no one knows the history of the Democratic Party, let's just call this little exercise Pin the Tail on the Donkey. And because I'm a conservative and can operate from a background of, the truth, then let me say right at the beginning that I don't expect you to take my word for any of this. You just be sure to go on out there and look it all up. Okay, here we go. Now, as with the 2016 presidential slate, the Democratic Party is much older than the young Republicans, so let's start pin the tail on the donkey with the first presidential cycle that had a Republican in the race. In 1856, the election was a three-way affair between Democrat James Buchanan, American Party candidate Millard Fillmore, and John C. Fremont, representing the fresh-out-of-the-box Republican Party, otherwise known to Democratic hecklers as the Black Republican Party. That was a racial slur used by the Democrats since the Republican Party was created specifically from disaffected Whigs in order to combat slavery. That's why the Republican Party was formed. Now, here are the results: a big Democratic win without a majority for James Buchanan, who would go on to secure the Democratic Party trifecta of having the three worst chief executives in American history: James Buchanan, Jimmy Carter, and President Golf Cart. Now, Buchanan sat for 4 years and watched the Civil War approaching. If there had been golf courses back then, he would have been on them, and maybe he would have taken the top spot. But as it was, he said in private he was going to be the last president of the United States, and he very nearly was. All Buchanan wanted was to survive his term before the shooting started. And so the job of, saving America fell to the next Republican candidate in 1860. Now, what most people don't realize about the election of Abraham Lincoln was that the 7 states of the deep Confederacy had left the Union before Lincoln even took office. Not only did the Republican not carry a single slaveholding state, there were entire counties in the Democratic South where he did not receive a single popular vote, not even one, not even as a joke or a protest. That's because the slaveholding, racist, Democratic states and politicians that had just left the Union to form the Confederacy knew that the election of a Republican president meant the end of slavery in America. You see this flag that modern Democrats try to pin on Republicans? It was invented, as was the entire Confederacy, because Democrats walked out of the Union because once a Republican president had been elected, slavery was finished in America. Now, that's why the person perhaps most singly responsible for ending slavery in America, the brilliant and courageous Frederick Douglass, once wrote, quote, "I'm a Republican, a black, dyed-in-the-wool Republican, and I never intend to belong to any other party than the party of freedom and progress." Don't believe me? Look it up. Moving on. In 1864, 1 year after Republican Abraham Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, the Democrats ran as their candidate George B. McClellan. Now, Lincoln had appointed the little Napoleon to command the Army of the Potomac, march down to Richmond, and end the war. But McClellan, who kept demanding more men, more wagons, more artillery, and more time, never seemed to get around to it, until finally he did, where he was promptly whipped by Robert E. Lee in the Peninsula Campaign. Now, although personally for continuing the war, McClellan bowed to the Democratic Party platform that called for immediate peace with the Confederacy, a move that would have ended the war and also given us 2 countries, one in which their cherished institution of slavery stayed intact. Now, one of the most influential Democratic delegates of 1864 was Clement Vallandigham from Ohio. He had called the Civil War to end slavery, quote, "a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war," unquote. His call for the Constitution as it is and the Union as it was became the de facto Democratic Party platform of 1864. The Union as it was, of course, meant the Union where slavery would be allowed to continue as it had under Democratic presidents. Unfortunately for the formerly Democrat and now Confederate slaveholders, the Confederacy lost that war, but they immediately went into overdrive in order to win the peace for racism. I hate to break it to you, but it was defeated Democrats that started the Ku Klux Klan, and it was these same former and then once again Democrats that created, in the years right after the Civil War, 2 modern institutions: gun control and marriage licenses. Gun control was enacted by Southern Democrats in order to keep guns out of the hands of newly freed black people. And marriage licenses, the idea that the government could tell people who could marry whom, was invented by Democrats to prevent black people from marrying white people. Don't believe me? Look it up. All of those lynchings, those were Democrats. The first black senators and representatives, they were all Republicans, including these two men. Republican Hiram Revels, the first black member of Congress, and Joseph Ramey, who became pro tempore Speaker of the House of Representatives and who received death threats from Southern Democrats for his efforts to suppress the KKK by force. Charming people, these Democrats, aren't they? It was Southern Democrats that wrote the Jim Crow laws that segregated the South in the century after the Civil War, and it was the post-Reconstruction elections of these Southern Democrats that were responsible for colored-only drinking fountains and colored-only cafeteria spaces and all the rest. Now, while it's hard to talk about the history of the Democratic Party without their incessant racism, which continues to this day, let's just very quickly look at democratic economics. Now, between 1920 and 1921, the United States entered its first actual depression. You probably haven't heard of it because it didn't last very long, and it didn't last very long because a Republican named Calvin Coolidge was president at the time, facing an economic slowdown at least as severe as the one that was to follow a decade later. Coolidge, being a Republican, cut the tax rate from 73%. In a few years, it became 24%. And he slashed federal spending by half. Shockingly, slashing the amount of money businessmen had to pay in taxes gave them more money to spend on their businesses, and that's exactly what they did. They were out of the Depression within a year or so, and the rest of the decade was called the Roaring Twenties because it was the economy that was roaring. Now, 10 years later, a Democratic president, Franklin Roosevelt, was faced with a similar set of problems. Roosevelt didn't cause the Depression, but his policies did turn it into the Great Depression. Unlike Republican Coolidge, who cut taxes and federal spending, FDR, the Democrat, raised the tax rate to 94% on the people who had the money to invest in getting businesses back on their feet. That money went to Washington for feel-good public works programs that created no new wealth at all, instead of letting businesses get back to work. What Coolidge killed in 2 years, Roosevelt's policies grew and nurtured into an 11-year Great Depression catastrophe that gutted this country so severely that people simply let him get away with anything he wanted, including most of the social welfare vote buying that has turned what was once the richest country in the world into the most indebted country in the world. Now, the Donkey Party also got their hoofs into the Constitution, and that's not a pretty tale either. I could and have, in fact, done about an hour on each of the three big progressive amendments, but we don't have that kind of time. So, in a nutshell, the 16th Amendment gave us the income tax so that today you can send about half of your money to Democrats in Washington for them to buy votes with. The 17th Amendment gave all of your power to Democrats in Washington by changing the way that people were elected to the Senate, the House of the States, which had previously protected states' interests and power, but which now became sort of a glorified country club. And, of course, the 18th Amendment, prohibition, which deprived you of your ability to have a drink at the end of the day to soften the blow of all of these racist and economic nightmares Democrats have inflicted upon America. By the way, it took Democrats to pass the only constitutional amendment to actually take away an existing freedom. It's kind of what they do, taking away people's freedom, but back to race. When those attack dogs were unleashed on black children trying to go to school in the South in the early 1960s, they were unleashed by Democrats like Bull Connor, Lester Maddox, and George Wallace. And when those fire hoses were turned on peaceful black protesters, those orders came from those same Democrats. So, why does black America vote so solidly Democratic? Well, the Democrats will tell you that the teams switch sides. You know, I didn't happen to get that memo. You know, the memo saying that all the racists now have to leave the Democratic Party and become Republicans, and all of the slavery-hating Republicans have to suddenly join the hated party of the Confederate battle flag, the KKK, and Jim Crow. I didn't get the memo because the memo doesn't exist. No one switched sides. The entire idea is ridiculous. It didn't happen. But something did happen. There was a switch, all right. And it was a switch masterminded by the great Democratic champion of black America, Lyndon Baines Johnson. Realizing that the South was emerging from its racist past to start voting Republican, he knew the game was over, and then he had an epiphany. Republicans and Democrats didn't switch sides, but the Democrats most certainly did switch strategies. And that switch in strategy can best be summed up by a direct quote from Democratic President Lyndon Baines Johnson, who said in the presence of two Southern governors, and I quote, "I'll have those voting Democratic for the next 200 years. And so far, he has. Because that was the new strategy for the Democrats, you see, and it's worked like a charm. Buy the votes of Black America with handouts. You know, just enough to keep them coming back every 2 years. It's a Democratic vote plantation is what it is. And Black America is enslaved to it as thoroughly as they were when they were slaves under Democratic politicians and policies, as we've just seen. The Democrats have hired, and at sub-minimum wage, I might add, Black America to vote for them in exchange for crappy housing, crappy food, crappy EBT cards, and crappy Obama phones. And if you're a Black American who's wondering why things just get worse and worse for Black America, well, your answer is that when it comes to your Democratic benefactors, you're not a customer. You're an employee. You're a minimum wage employee. We Republicans find this entire entitlement slavery disgusting. We want no part of it. The Republican Party was formed in opposition to slavery of any kind, and it remains that way to this day. So why haven't you heard about this horrible tale that belongs to that donkey? Well, it's because of what my friend and colleague Andrew Klavan calls the Democratic ring of power. It's the press, or in Andrew's words, they're precious. Like the ring of power, it grants Democrats the power of invisibility. The power to come back again and again and again with their policies of economic failure and racial slavery, secure in the knowledge that no one will ever see what they did the last time they tried it. It's kind of a shame about the internet, because now all of you can go and look all of this up for yourself. Anyway, that's whom we're dealing with, so go find out for yourself how true all of this is, and then for your own sake and the sake of the country, don't be an ass.